All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Beautiful to have ahead of us today. Begin by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Ed and Faith Wolf, and family in memory of our beloved father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, Cyrus Wolf Shalom ben Tzvi Hirsch Zichron Livracha. Daf Yomi sponsors today, Stephanie Rabinowitz, in memory of her father, Moshe ben Chaim, as well as by Said and Sima Hakin, in memory of Said's father, Moshe ben Bashi HaKohen Zichron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all the neshamas will have an aliyah and the families a nechama. And also with that, let us begin. So we are picking up today at the 2 dots. Today's daf is Lamed 30. We are picking up on Chav Tessimon Beis 29b at the 2 dots, 5 lines up from the bottom. I'm Rabbi Yehuda Mishmuel. Kol shu lifton kedei le'achol bo, kol she'eno lifton kedei le'achol imenu. So we'll say this statement actually crystallizes something that we mentioned yesterday. So still focusing on how much food you have to use for your Eruv. So the Gemara says it depends on the type of food. Shmuel says it depends on the type of food. Kol shu liftan, but say any food item which is used as a condiment. So remember again, it's not a main meal, but rather it's used as like a dip, as a condiment. Kedei le'achol bo. So we'll say you have to use enough. So in order for you to use it as an Eruv, you have to go ahead and use enough of it, which would be used in the course of 2 meals. So we'll say, so for example, maybe a similar example. Let's say you're making your Eruv out of ketchup. So what the Gemara, what Shmuel is saying over here is, you don't have to actually have enough ketchup to eat 2 meals of just ketchup. Rather, what would you need? The amount of ketchup that you would normally use for dipping over the course of 2 meals. But if something is an actual food item, right? If something is an actual food item, then halacha l'maisa, you have to go ahead and use enough of it that you would actually eat in 2 meals. So, for example, if you were using meat, so you'd have to go ahead and use enough meat to actually have 2 sudos. So we'll say if it's a condiment, enough of the condiment that you would use over the course of 2 meals. If it's actual food item, then the actual amount of food which would be consumed over the course of 2 meals. Basar chai. What about raw meat? Kedei le'achol himenu. So we'll say, so again, if it's raw meat, so kedei le'achol himenu, you have to have enough meat that you could eat 2 meals of it. 2 meals of it. So Rashi says over here, eno lifton. We're going to see what the Gemara is intrigued by is what's the status of raw meat. Is raw meat considered to be a condiment, or is raw meat considered to be a main dish? Basar, so the Gemara says over here it's considered to be a main dish, therefore you need enough of it to eat 2 meals. Basar tzli, roasted meat. Rabba Amar kedei le'achol bo. Rav Yosef Omer kedei le'achol himenu. So this is actually very interesting. When it comes to roasted meat, so apparently there's a machlokes. Is it a condiment or is it a main? So Rabba said kedei le'achol bo, enough to eat it as a side dish, as a condiment over the course of 2 meals. And Rav Yosef said, enough to go ahead and make of it of 2 meals. Amar Rav Yosef, mina minallah. Rav Yosef says, how do I know that roasted meat is considered to be not just a side dish, but lamaisa is a main? Dahani parsai achli tavhaki below nama. Because these Persians, they eat roasted meat without any bread. So you see, they eat roasted meat as a main dish. Amalei Abaye. Uparsai havaruba de alma. I don't understand the Persians, the majority of the world. Well, it goes back to yesterday. Like, just because you find someone who does something does not automatically make that normative practice. So are the Persians the majority of the world? V'hatanan big de aniyim la'aniyim, big de ashirim la'ashirim. So this is talking about the halachas of tumah. How large does an article of clothing have to be in order to be makabel tumah? Well, it depends. For aniyim, it's 1 shear. For ashirim, for the rich, it's a different shear. For an ani, even a piece of fabric that is 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths is significant. And therefore, as makabel tumah, by an ashir, it would have to be 3 tfachim by 3 tfachim. Top of lamed. Aval big de ashirim la'aniyim lo. I would say, but this is very interesting. If an ani goes ahead and has the garment of an ashir. So let's say the poor person is wearing a rich man's garment. So we'll say halacha l'maisa, we don't say that therefore the halachas of tumah and tara are governed by the garment, but rather they're governed by the individual. So even if an ani goes ahead and wears a rich man's garment, halacha l'maisa, the shear for tumah is still going to be 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths. Look at the top Rashi. Kilomar la'aniyim lo ba'inan big de ashirim ela kevan l'dido chazu Azli basraya hachanami avagav de parsai lav liftanhu kevan didan havi liftan niski b'shir zuta. So we'll say, just like if the ani goes ahead and wears a rich man's clothing, so the halachas of tumah and tahara are not governed by the article of clothing. They're governed by what? By the wearer, by the person who wears them. So if a person is an ani, a piece of fabric that's 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths is significant. So too the Gemara wants to suggest that it's very nice that the Persians eat roasted meat as a main dish, but the most of us use it as a side dish, and therefore halacha l'maisa, that's how it will be reckoned for eruv purposes. So maybe you'll say, well, why don't we just go ahead and make it l'chumra in both cases? And we'll say, let's say by halachas of tumah and tara, we'll say l'chumra. So therefore, even if an ani wears a rich man's article of clothing, halacha l'maisa, the shear is governed by the gavra, not by the cheftza. Right? The shear is governed by the ani. Therefore, 3 finger breadths by 3 fingers. That's a chumra. And let's say the same thing over here by eruv. Let's treat roasted meat like a main dish. Right? We'll say that's a chumra. Why is that a chumra? Because that will require you to have more roasted meat than if you just treated roasted meat as a side dish. To which the Gemara says, "Tanya, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, ma'arvin lechola ulazakin kedei mezono, ularavasan besuda beinonis shel kol adam." But yet, I will say we learned that what Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says that you go ahead when determining, I will say, how much food to go ahead and use for an eruv. So if a person is ill, we determine how much he would eat. If a person is old, we determine how much he would eat. And if somebody is a very big eater, exceptionally gluttonous, we don't measure his suda by what he eats, but rather what? We measure it by what is considered to be a normative suda of a normative individual. So we'll say, what do you see from here? You see that when it comes to determining eruv amounts, we don't go l'chumra, rather we go l'kula. Right? They will say, obviously, a sick person eats less than a regular person. An old person, the Gemara is making the assumption, eats less than a young person. So you see that when it comes to eruv, we actually are mekel when determining the amounts. To which the Gemara says, kasha. Einachinami, this is a kasha, this is a question. Omi amar Reb Shimon Elazar hachi. Did Reb Shimon really say this? We'll say that's what? That if a person is very gluttonous, so we won't determine mazon shtei seudos based on what they eat, but rather based on the meal of a regular individual. Vatanya, we learned, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Og melech habashan, pischo kimaloo. So we'll say this is actually an interesting halacha. So if you look at Rashi for just a moment, pischo kimaloo, lahatzil al shar psochim, v'ileka pasach techazile, kol chor male egrov shebeksalim tmeir. Well, listen to this. So the halacha is as follows. If a person dies inside of a house, so obviously there's tumas ohel when whatever is underneath the same roof. Let's say there are multiple entranceways or exits of the home. So the halacha is only the entranceway through which you're going to take the mace becomes ritually impure. Everything else remains tahar. So let's say Og Melech Habashan, which Shabbos of course is the statement, is the name that's used for someone who's exceptionally large. So let's say someone exceptionally large dies in the house. Pischo Kimaloo. Only if there is an opening that is the size of Og Melech Habashan, we assume the body is going to be taken out that way. Therefore, that entranceway and anything under it becomes tamei, but all the other entranceways remain tahar. Va'abaye hasam hechi the avid hadume nadame v'nafke. So we'll say Abaye says that case is different. Why? Because at the end of the day, what should we do? Will we dismember the body and take it out piece by piece? Of course not. Maybe you understand that the body is going to come out one way. So the Gemara says, Pligi Rabbanan alei Rabbi Shimon Elazar. So the Rabbanan argue, so Ibayluhu, Pligi Rabbanan alei Rabbi Shimon Elazar, Olo. So the Rabbanan argue or not in this case of Tumah, Tashma, Amar Rabba Bar Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Og Melech Habashan, Pischo Ba'arba'a. Supposed to listen to this. So Rabbi Yochanan says that Og Melech Habashan, if you have an opening in the home that is at least 4 tfachim wide, so halacha l'maisa, that is going to be the area that becomes tamei, and everything else remains tahar. Hasam deika psachim kitanim tuva, v'ika chad dahavi arba. In that case, Rabbi said there are many small entrances, less than 4 tfachim, and only one entrance of 4 tfachim. Therefore, ki kamaravach, bahu kamaravach. I will say it's clear that halacha l'maisa, when you take the body out there, even though again that entranceway is not large enough, you're going to have to enlarge it. But l'maisa, it's clear that that is the entranceway through which you are going to take out the body. Amrav Chi bar Ashi bar Avashi, Amrav Ma'avim bebasar chai. So Basar comes along, Rav, and says you can make an eruv with raw meat. Amrav Sim bar Chia, Ma'arvim bebeitzim chayis. You could also go ahead and make an eruv with raw eggs. V'kama, how many eggs do you have to use? Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, achos, Sinai amar shtayim. So Nachman bar Yitzchak said one egg, and Sinai, I will say Sinai, Rashi says, is Rav Yosef. They used to call him Sinai, was his nickname. Why? Shahayabaki b'mishnayos b'braises, because he possessed an incredible amount of knowledge. So because of that, he used to call him Sinai. Good. So we'll say, so again, the takeaway from this last sugya is that the mazon shtei seudos, we already mentioned this yesterday, mazon shtei seudos is determined by the use of the food. So if the food being used for the eruv is a condiment or is a side dish, so you don't need enough of that food to make an entire meal, 2 meals for an eruv, but rather again, you take the amount of the side dish that would be eaten over the course of 2 meals, the amount of the condiment that would be eaten over the course of 2 meals, and that becomes your eruv. Versus if you go ahead and you use a food which is normally a main dish, for that you would need 2 full meals of that main dish food. Good. So Melachu, so the Gemara says, Tano der, min hamazon mutar b'mayim. So let's remember again, going back to the Mishnah now. So the Mishnah says, if a person takes a neder, not to eat mazon, right? Not to eat food. So what's the halacha? A person is permitted to eat water and salt. This is part of the Mishnah's theme, right? That water and salt essentially are not reckoned as food. So it says the Gemara, melach u'mayim hudulo ikri mazon. So apparently it's only water and salt that are not called mazon. Ha called mili ikri mazon. But apparently everything else is called mazon. So the Gemara says, lema tehevet yufta Rav Shmuel. So we'll say apparently this would refute the position of Rav and Shmuel. How so? Da'ami tarvayu, ein mevarchen borei minei mazonos, ela al chameshes haminen bilvad. So we'll say ultimately again, Rav and Shmuel both say, you only make a borei minei mazonos on grain-based items, right? Items that come from the 5 grains. So we'll say, so remember again, why is this a kasha? Because when the Gemara says, hanoja min hamazon, if I take a neder not to eat mazon, the only thing I'm permitted to eat is water and salt, which then tells you that what? Everything else is considered mazon. Well, if everything else is considered mazon, then what bracha should everything else get? What bracha? Borei minei mazonos. Yet Rav and Shmuel said the only time you say borei minei mazonos is when? On grain-based items. To which the Gemara says, "Velo usvine chad zimna." So the Gemara says, "Okay, we already answered. You asked this question already once before, and we already answered it back in Meseches Brachas. Lema tehevti tiyuv tayu namemeha." The Gemara is right, but the Gemara is just saying that this Gemara should also serve as a refutation to the positions of Rav and Shmuel. Am Rav Huna ba'omer kol hazan alai. Both say, what's the case in the Mishnah? The case in the Mishnah is not where a person said, "I hereby take a neder prohibiting all mazon onto me." Rather, he made a neder saying, "Kol hazan alai." Anything which sustains should be prohibited to me. Look at Rashi, I will say, "Ba'omer kol hazan alai masnisin da asra le b'chol mili lav da amar ye asra alai mazon devadei lo mikri mazon elahi minin." So I will say, Rashi, everybody agrees that mazon is a very specific group. Mazon refers to foods that come from the 5 grains. Everyone agrees with that. And the Gemara says, "Dav min dagan dezaini v'sadi liba ela kegon da amar ye'asr alai." I'm reading Rashi. "Ye'asr alai kol hazan demashma kol davar hamasbia v'chol mili zaini chutz mi'ayim u'melach aval misad lo sadi v'lo mikri mazon." Suppose listen to this. So apparently there's 2 different lashonas. Mazon, Rabbi refers to food that fills and satiates. So remember again, that's a reference dafka to foods made of the 5 grains. The case in the Mishnah is where a guy says, "Kol hazan alai." Anything ultimately, again, which provides me with some level of satiety, so ultimately that will be prohibited. I will say, so zan is a much more inclusive category than mazon. Mazon dafka refers to food from the groups of 5 grains. Zan refers to anything which ultimately has some sustaining ability. Se'ina chinami, if a person takes a neder and he says, I hereby prohibit kol hazan, anything which is zan, so zan includes everything except for water and salt. So the Gemara says, so ba'omer kol hazan alai, ma'im u'melachud lo zaini. Water and salt do not satiate in any way. Ha kol mili zaini, but everything else does satiate in some way. V'hamar Rabbi Rachana. But is that true that all other items satiate in some way? Let's listen to this. Rabbi Bachana said, When we used to follow Rabbi Yochanan, when he wanted to go eat the fruit of ginosa, right? Both say the Gemara Maseches Brachas discusses that the fruits of ginosa were so incredibly sweet that you often had to eat them with a piece of bread in order to blunt their sweetness. The Gemara attributes this to the fact that ginosar is opposite one of the entranceways to Gan Eden. So as a result, the fruit that grow there are exceptionally sweet. So comes along Rabbi Bachan, and he says, when we used to follow behind Rabbi Yochanan to eat the fruits of ginosar, what happened? So the Gemara says, Ki havinan bemeya hava maktinan l'chol chad v'chad asara. If there are 100 students, so we would each take 10 fruit. Ki havinan be'asara hava maktinan l'chol chad v'chad meya u'meya. If we were 10 students, so ultimately each student took 100 fruit. And I will say, what happened? So, and both said the fruits were so large that every 100 fruit could not fit into a 3-sa'a basket. A lot of fruit. Both listen to this is wild. And what happened? Rabbi Yochanan would eat all of the fruit. And he said, I swear, it's like I haven't eaten a thing. So as I see it, he would eat all of this fruit. So we'll say, so what's the point? What's the point? The point over here is you see that apparently there are some things that do not satiate. In other words, you wanted to say it's just water and salt that don't satiate. But here's an example: the fruits of ginosa, they're delicious, they're sweet, but apparently they don't satiate either. To which the Gemara says, "You're right, ema mizona." Ema mizona. So we'll say that the lashon of the Mishnah ultimately, again, is mizona, that I hereby prohibit anything that is mizona. So we'll say mizona is a more narrow. So apparently, what you have over here is 3 different lashonos, right? You have mazon, zan, and mizona. Mazon refers to foods that come from the 5 grains. Zan refers to anything that refers to anything pretty much, and mizon refers to something that has a satiating ability. Amrav Huna, Amrav, Shvosh lo ochal kikar zos. Well, it's fine. So bottom line, remember this Gemara. So what we were just doing over here is just defining the scope of the neder. See, even though the Mishnah phrased it as hanoder min hamazon, really again what it was hanoder min hamazona. Hamazona. And what does mizona come to include? Mizona comes to include really anything that has some level of satiety associated with it. The only things not included in mizona is what? Ultimately, water and salt. Amrav Huna, Amrav, Shua shelo ochal kikarzu, ma'arvin loba. Well, listen to this. If a person, so Rav said as follows, if a person takes a shvua not to eat this kikar, so I swear that I make a shvua, I'm not going to eat this loaf of bread, you can go ahead and use it for an eruv. Ma'arvin loba. Now, we'll say, now what's the logic? Look at Rashi. Delo nader ela me'achila, listen to this. So when I take a shvuah not to eat a loaf of bread, I will say, what am I prohibiting? Consumption. What am I not prohibiting? Hana. So if I swear I'm not going to eat this loaf of bread, I'm not allowed to eat it, but I can still get hana, I can still get benefit from it by using it as part of the eruv. However, kikar zu alai, people say if I make a shvuah, right, or the lashon is this loaf is hereby prohibited to me. Then Abba say that's not just prohibiting consumption, that's also prohibiting hana benefit. Therefore, ein ma'arvin loba. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, I can't make an eruv with this loaf. So meisvei the Gemara raises the kasha hanoder min hakikar ma'arvin loba. If someone makes a neder from a loaf of bread, ultimately again ma'arvin loba, you could use it for an eruv. My lav da amar alai. Are we not talking about where a person said kikar zu alai, and yet you see that he's still allowed to use it? Lo da amar zu. No, rather he said kikar zu. Right? Shlo ochal kikar zu. So we'll say. So remember again, you hear the difference when you prohibit the kikar for consumption. Right? If you say I won't eat the kikar, that's fine. You're prohibiting consumption, but you can still get hana. When you use the lashon of kikar zu alai, I hereby prohibit this loaf onto me. Onto me is a much more expansive prohibition that covers not only consumption, but covers hana as well. To which the Gemara says, Hachanai Mistaber, this seems to be clear. Diktani Seifa im Masai. Ultimately, again, when is this so? Bisman Sha'amar Shvua Shalo et Amena. When is it so that you could use the loaf for the Eruv? when you took an oath that you will not eat of the kikar. So again, your oath covers consumption, but hana is still permitted. Aval amr alai mai. Also, if a person said, I hereby prohibit this kikar onto me, what's the halacha? Hachanami de'in ma'arvin loba. So we'll say again, once you say kikar zu alai, then you're prohibiting not only consumption, but you are also prohibiting hana, and therefore halacha l'maaseh it can't be used as an eruv. If that's the case, adatani, kikar zu hektish ein ma'arvin loba. So we'll say, we said in that same brayso that if you have a loaf that belongs to hektish, you cannot go ahead and use it for eruv. So why? Lefi she'ein ma'arvin behekdeshos. Because we'll say the halacha is you cannot make an eruv out of consecrated items. Why even bring up this case at all? Liflog v'lisnei b'didei. Just go ahead and split the first case. What's the case? Da'amar zu. We'll say ultimately again, when can you use the kikar for an eruv? Even if you prohibited, when you said kikar zu, right? I will not eat this kikar. So you can't eat it, but you can get benefit. Aval omer alai. But once a person says alai, this kikar is prohibited onto me. Ein ma'arvin loba. We'll say under those circumstances, it cannot be used for eruv at all. Because when you say alai, alai prohibits, we'll say not only consumption, but also hana. Amar l'charafuna elamai kol heicha da amar alai ma'arvin. I'm sorry. Amar l'charafuna elamai kol heicha da amar alai ma'arvin. Rather, what you have to say is according to Rav Huna, apparently, even if you say alai, ultimately you can make it, you can use it for an eruv. If that's the case, kasheresha. Both say that contradicts what we just said before, because we just said before that if you say alai, alai precludes you from using it for an eruv. To which the Gemara says, in reality, the Bryce is missing a piece, and here's how you have to state it. If a person makes a neder not to eat a loaf of bread, you can still go ahead and use it for the eruv. Vafilu amar alai naaseh ke'omer shvua shelo et amena. And even if you say kikar zu alai, the way we interpret alai is an oath that you will not eat it. And therefore the prohibition is upon consumption, but hana'a will still be permitted. Mikol makom kashi l'Rafuna. We'll say still again it poses a question according to Rafuna. Hu damar Rabbi Eliezer. So Rafuna holds like Rabbi Eliezer. The Sanya, Rabbi Eliezer, Omer, shvur shelo ochal kikar zu ma'arvin lo ba. If I take a shvur not to eat this kikar, I can go ahead and still use it for an eruv because I can get benefit from it. However, kikar zu alai, if a person goes ahead and says, this kikar is prohibited onto me, ein ma'arvin lo ba, ultimately, again, it cannot be used for eruv. So I'll say, so again, so this is the position of Rabbi Eliezer. Umi amar Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer actually say this. V'atanya, we learned, zeh haklal, adam oser atzmo ba'ochel ma'arvin lo ba. But so yet we learned as follows. Here's the principle. If a person prohibits himself to a certain food, halacha l'may, so you can still use it as an eruv. However, ochel hane'asar lo la'adam ein ma'arvin lo ba. But I will say, so listen to this. If a person prohibits a certain food to himself, halacha l'maysa, he is still permitted to go and use it as an eruv. But food that is usher to a person cannot be used for an eruv. I will say, look at Rashi for just a moment. Adam osir atzmo ba'ochel, shetala haneder b'maiseh shu osir ba'atzmo, dahanu shelo ochel. So we'll say, for example, if a person takes a neder and says, I am not going to eat this loaf of bread, ma'arvin lo ba, Rashi says, delav haneder melehi v'lo ihu avid. So we'll say, so even if I take a neder not to eat a loaf of bread, I am still permitted to go ahead and use it for my eruv, right? Because that's considered to be a little bit more of an indirect hana'ah. But look at but what is the next Rashi? Ochel hanesar la'adam kigon kikar zu te'asr alai o shvur shlo ena mikikar zu. We will say if a person goes ahead and makes a more expansive prohibition, like a person says this kikar is asr onto me, then halacha l'maisa in ma'arvin bo. Why lefi she'ein ma'arvin lo behekdeshos. Ultimately, again, because halacha l'maisa, you cannot go ahead and make an eruv with hekdesh. So we'll say just like hekdesh is something that is totally prohibited for use from the individual, so too when a person says kikar zu alai, that's kiviyachal like he's making it hekdesh. To which the Gemara says, Trei Tanai Vali with Rabbi Eliezer. Inachinami, both say it's a machlokes, and there are two different Tanam, two different opinions when it comes to the position of Rabbi Eliezer. So both say, just so you understand the logic of this is as follows. So it seems to be, the way the Gemara ends off is in the following way. That halacha l'maisa, if a person says, I take a shvua not to eat the loaf, everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa you could use it for the Eruv. Because although he prohibited consumption, benefit is still permitted. Benefit is still permitted, and usage for the Eruv will be benefit which is permitted. But what about the fact that he can't eat it? So remember again, we've already seen before in the Mishnah, inability to eat your Eruv does not preclude your Eruv from being effective. As long as what? As long as someone has the ability to eat the Eruv, you are good to go. You are good to go. So too over here. I can't eat the Eruv, but I can get benefit from the Eruv, and therefore someone else could also eat the Eruv. But if I say, Kikar zu alai, right, the moment I go ahead and I make a more expansive prohibition, prohibiting the Kikar onto me, that seems to be in the eyes of the Gemara much more expansive, that precludes Hana in any way, and therefore can't be used as the Eruv. Good. Ma'arvin l'nazir b'yayin. So we'll say, Salach l'mais, the Mishnah said, you can make an Eruv for a Nazir out of wine. Because as we said before, even though the Nazir can't drink the wine, someone else can. To which the Gemara says, Mas nisin telo ki Beis Shammai. Our Mishnah does not reflect the view of Beis Shammai. What does that mean? So the Gemara says, Desanya Beis Shammai omrim, Ein ma'arvin l'nazir b'yayin uli Yisrael b'truma. Beis Shammai said, you cannot make an Eruv for a Nazir with wine or for a Yisrael with truma. Beis Hillel omrim ma'arvin l'nazir b'yayin uli Yisrael b'truma. So we'll say, Machlokas Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai says, you can't make an Eruv with something you cannot eat. Beis Hillel says, you can. Even if you can't eat it, as long as someone could eat it. So the Nazir could use wine. He can't drink the wine, but someone else can. The Yisrael can't go ahead and eat the truma, that's fine, but the Kohen can. Machlokus Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. Amru lahen Beis Hillel Beis Shammai. So Beis Hillel said to Beis Shammai, Iatem modim, Amud Beis. Iatem modim shema arvin legadol b'yom kippurim. Well, so listen to how interesting this is. So Beis Hillel says to Beis Shammai, don't you agree that halacha l'maisa, you can make an Eruv for an adult on Yom Kippur? And we'll say, look at Rashi just a moment. Tap Rashi lam lam days. Shema arvin legadol lemishu gadol shehevi shtei saros shechayiv beinui va'af agav de lemachar lo chazile hoyel v'chazile katan sheino bar onshin. Now listen to this. You can make an Eruv, right? Whether it's an Eruv Chatzeros or whether it's an Eruv Tchumen, you can make an Eruv for an adult on Yom Kippur. Then I will say, now what happens to that Eruv for an adult on Yom Kippur? The adult can't eat it. But rather, what do we say? Why is so? I don't understand if the adult can't eat the Eruv because it's Yom Kippur. So how is the Eruv effective? Even though the adult can't eat it, what? A child can. So you see, you see from here that halacha l'maisa, the Eruv need not be edible to the person who's making it. It just has to be edible by someone. Amru lahem, to which Beis Shammai responds to Beis Hillel, aval amru lahem kishem shema arvin lagadol b'yom kippurim kema arvin nazir b'yayin liyisrael b'truma. So I'm sorry, this is Beis Hillel still talking. And Beis Hillel says the same way that you could go ahead and make an Eruv for an adult on Yom Kippur, even though the adult can't eat the food, but a katan can, so too you can make an Eruv for a Nazir out of wine, and you can make an Eruv for a Yisrael out of Truma. Beis Hillel proving their point from Yom Kippur, that as long as someone could eat the Eruv, even if it's not the person who's actually making it, that works. Or Beis Shammai will say, Hasam ika suda haru'uya mi ba'od yom, hachaleka suda haru'uya mi ba'od yom. So Beis Shammai says, no, that's not fair. There's a fundamental distinction, which I will say is, that suda, meaning the Eruv, was consumable by the Gadol Erev Yom Kippur. Erev Yom Kippur, so as there was a point in time, where halacha l'maisa, the Erev was permitted to the person who's making it. For the Nazir with wine, it was never permitted. For the Yisrael b'truma, it was never permitted. Look at Rashi, Miba'od Yom, Shal Erev Yom Kippurim. So again, Beis Shammai says to Beis Hillel, that's not a fair analogy. While it is true that the Gadol can't eat the Eruv on Yom Kippur, he could have consumed it on Erev Yom Kippur. In other words, this food is technically edible by the person making the Eruv. There's just an issue that it's Yom Kippur and you can't eat. That's different than the wine by the Nazir, right? The Nazir can't drink the wine. The Yisrael can't eat the Truma. To which the Gemara says, Kiman delo kechananya. So I'll say, whose opinion is reflected here? Not like Chananya. Desanyo, Chananya Omer, Kol Atzman Shebei Shammai lo hayumodim be'eruv ad sheyotze mitaso v'chol kli tashmish shol l'sham. This is actually very dramatic. So Chananya says that Beis Shammai's entire shita in general, when it came to Eruv, they both say this is best illustrated with like an Eruv Tchumen. So let's remember again, what's an Eruv Tchumen? I want to extend my Tchum 2,000. I want to extend my Tchum, right? Tchum 2,000 amos is normally measured from the edge of the city. I want to extend my tchum a bit more, so what do? I have to establish a makom shvisa. I have to establish a domicile. And if I establish a domicile, then the 2,000 amas could be counted from that domicile. So normally we assume, how do you establish your domicile? Food. Beis Shammai says, or Chananya says, according to Beis Shammai, Chananya says, Kol ason shel Beis Shammai, the entire essence of Beis Shammai, shita lo hayumodim be'eruv. In order to make an eruv, what would you have to do according to Beis Shammai? Yotzi mitasa, you have to bring your bed. V'chol kli tashmishu l'sham, and any utensils that you're going to use for Shabbos. Both say, according to Chananya's understanding of Beis Shammai, in order to mamish make an eruv, you have to literally establish a real makom shvisa, a real domicile. And how do you establish a real domicile? Your bed, your utensils. Putting some food somewhere is not going to be enough. So the Gemara says, Keman azlaha desanyo. So whose opinion is reflected in the following brisa? Ire b'shchorim lo yetze b'levanim. If you made your eruv on Erev Shabbos, right, when you sat down at the end of your 2,000 amas in order to extend your tchum, so that's the clothing you have to wear on Shabbos itself. You can't put on new clothing for Shabbos. Lo yetze b'levanim. B'levanim lo yetze b'shchorim. And if you're wearing white clothing when you made the eruv on Erev Shabbos, you cannot go ahead and change into black clothing. Now, look at Rashi for just a moment. Ire b'shchorim, says Rashi, hayalav shchorim v'halach v'yashav b'sof al paimam. A person was wearing black clothing, and he went and he sat at the end of 2,000 amas, at shekana makom shavisa shekidish alayom v'chazra lebeso. So I say salach lamay. So whatever clothing you were wearing at the time you established your makom shvisa, that's the clothing you have to wear over the course of Shabbos. So the Gemara says, Kiman, whose opinion does this reflect? Amra Nachman Bar Yitzchak, Chananyahi va'aliba de Beis Shammai. It is Chananya according to Beis Shammai. Because we'll say apparently the idea is that according in Chananya's understanding of Beis Shammai is that halacha lemaisa, anything and everything that you are going to use on Shabbos must be present at that makom shavisa at the onset of Shabbos in order to go ahead and extend your tchum. But anything that was not there, that was not present at your quote-unquote new domicile at the beginning of Shabbos cannot be used over the course of Shabbos. So if you were establishing your new domicile so as to extend your tchum, whatever clothing you were wearing at that time, that's the clothing you wear on Shabbos. To which the Gemara says, Chananya, b'shchorim hu lo yetze, aval hu lo yetze, ha b'levanim yetze. So we'll say, so it sounds like the Chananya, okay, the Chananya is saying, whatever clothing you were wearing at the time that you established your makom shavisa, so as to extend your tchum, that's the clothing that you have to continue to wear. You can't put on new clothing. But one second, but didn't Chananya just say beforehand that halacha l'maisa, in order to go ahead and establish a makom shavisa, what do you have to do? You have to take out everything you're going to need for Shabbos. Right? You just saw that before. You need kol klei tashisho. You need your bed. You need your utensils. Look at Rashi. Kol klei tashmisho. Mashma di'ilo afi kol tzarchei tashmish lo havi eruv lididei. It sounded like before that halacha l'maisa, if you did not take out all of your utensils, the eruv did not work. To which the Gemara says, Hachi Kamar, this is what it means to say. Irev belevanim v'hotzrach l'shchorim af belevanim lo yetze. So let's listen to this. So what he's saying is as follows. If you went ahead and when you established your domicile, you were wearing your white clothing, but then halacha l'maisa, you needed black clothing, you can't even go out with your white clothing. I will say, what's the logic of this? What Chananya is saying about saying this is an incredibly machmir position. What Chananya is saying is, in order for you to, just to be clear, what we'll call him Ruvain, what is Ruvain trying to accomplish? He wants to extend his tchum 2,000 amas, right? He wants to extend tchum father. So what he does is, Erev Shabbos, he leaves his city, he stays within 2,000 amas of his city, and he establishes a new domicile. The goal is then he'll be able to measure 2,000 amas from the new domicile. Chananya is saying as follows. In order to establish a new domicile, anything and everything you will need for that Shabbos must be present at that new domicile. To the point that Chananya says as follows. If Reuven is wearing white clothing, and then on Shabbos he says, oh, you know what, I need black clothing, he can't go out with any clothing, why Rabbi saying? Because the fact that he needed black clothing and it's not there indicates that what? He did not bring all of his needs with him to the Makom Shvisa. If you did not bring all of your needs to your Makom Shvisa, then the Makom Shvisa is ineffective and you can't extend the Tchum. So the Gemara says, Kiman, Amram Nachar Bar Yitzchak, Chananyahi, Vali B'Dvei Shammai. It's the position of Chananya and in accordance with Beis Shammai. So obviously, halacha l'maisa, we do not go ahead and accept this position of Chananya. We hold, and we'll see this in greater depth, we hold that in order to establish a domicile, so as to extend your Tchum, all you need is food. Right? Home is where your food is. You do not have to bring out your other utensils, as Beis Shammai had mentioned. So I'll say, furthermore, again, halacha l'maisa, we passing like Beis Hillel, and therefore you can go ahead and make an eruv. Ultimately, again, for a nazir with wine, for a Yisrael is truma, because as we saw in the Mishnah, as long as someone could eat that eruv food, even if you can't eat it, the eruv is still effective. Sumchos omer bechulin. So remember again, sumchos holds, however, Yisrael cannot go ahead and make an eruv with truma, but rather he must use chulin. Ve'ilu lenazir b'yayin lo pligi. So we'll say, yet interesting enough, so this is actually quite fascinating. So sumchos argues on the case of the nazir. Sumchos argues on the case of truma. So whereas the Rabbanon say that a Yisrael can go ahead and make an eruv with truma, even though he can't eat it because the Kohen can. Sumchos doesn't argue on the case of the nazir with yayin. So Sumchos seems to say that a nazir can make an eruv with yayin. So my timer, what's the reason? Efshar the matchil anazirusei. We'll say very interesting, because technically speaking, Sumchos will say like this: you can go ahead and have your neder nazirus annulled. So because you could have your neder nazirus annulled, Rashi says, mitchal iluye v'yiftach becharata lo niskavanti lekach utnan hektish tos eno hektish. So we'll say salach l'mais. I'm sorry, the wrong Rashi. The mishal nazirus say yishal lechacham v'yatilo nidro v'yeyayin ra'ila. So we'll say, so again, there are ways to go ahead and annul vows. So remember, a nazirus is a vow. So technically speaking, there's a way to get out of that vow. So since there's a way to get out of the vow, to annul the vow, therefore halacha l'maisa, Sumchos is comfortable allowing a nazir to make an eruv with wine, since he could always annul his vow and the wine becomes permitted. Iachi, truma nami ifshar de mitchel iluye. But it's actually quite fascinating. You know that you could also go ahead and annul a truma designation. And about you say to yourself, how can you possibly annul a truma designation? So it's actually interesting. If halacha l'maisa, a person makes the wrong produce truma, I didn't mean to make this batch truma, I meant to make that batch truma. So technically speaking, you could have the truma designation lifted off one grouping of produce and transfer into something else. So we'll say, if you're going to tell me that the reason Sumchos is comfortable in allowing a nazir to make an eruv with wine is because he could always have his neder nazirus annulled, well, guess what? You could also annul truma designation and shift the truma designation from batch A to batch B, thereby permitting batch A for regular Yisrael consumption. Imitchil Allah hajrul tivla. We'll say, here's the problem. If you go ahead and you annul the truma designation, we'll say, what happens to the produce? It just once again becomes tevel. It becomes tevel. Then we'll say, what's the problem with tevel? You can't eat tevel either. So either way, you're a little bit stuck, right? If it's truma and I'm a Yisrael, I can't eat it. And even if you tell me that I could annul the truma designation, that's fine. But once I annul the truma designation, then halacha l'maisa, the produce becomes tevel, to which the Gemara says, lo nechshedu chaverim litra, v'lifrosh alei mimakom acher. So, okay, but I have a simple eitzah. So annul the truma designation, so now the produce becomes tevel. I will say, you could always go ahead and separate out trumas and maestras from another produce. So as I will say, technically speaking, although it is ideal to separate out truma from the produce that's in front of you, technically speaking, you could go and designate truma from produce at a different location or a different area on the produce that is in front of you right now. So the Rabbi says, so watch this. So why don't we just say conceptually the following will happen. Let a Yisrael go ahead and make an eruv with truma. Why? Because how do we view it? Technically speaking, you could annul the truma designation. But once you annul the truma designation, then what? It becomes tevel and it's not consumable. No, because you could always go ahead and designate another batch of or some other produce as truma on this batch over here, and therefore, technically speaking, it's edible. To which the Gemara says, "Lo nechshedu chaverim litram shalom min hamukav." I will say, generally, Talmidei Chachamim do not go ahead and separate out Truma, Shalom, and Amukaf. Shalom and Amukaf means that I will say, although technically speaking, you can separate out Truma on produce that is right in front of you from a batch of produce that is somewhere else that is less than ideal. That's called Shalom and Amukaf, not from the immediate proximity. Ideally, we do not like to do that. So because you don't like to do that, therefore we don't want to advance this particular method. V'lifrosh ale mineu bei. So we'll say, the less, Gemara says, so why not go ahead? Why not go ahead and just separate out Truma from the batch front? In other words, annul, let's view it as follows. You could technically annul the Truma designation. Then the produce becomes Tameh. So, I'm sorry, the produce becomes Tavel. So no problem. Just separate out Truma right then and there. To which the Gemara says, here's the problem. The less Beis Shiura. So you'll say, we're assuming that we're dealing with food that is exactly the amount of Mazon Shtei Seudos. Well, if it's exactly the amount of Mazon Shtei Seudos, and you separate out some of it for Truma, then what's going to happen, Rabosai? Then ultimately, again, you're not going to have Mazon Shtei Seudos. Umay Paska, Elo Sumchos Savala Kirabanan. Rather, Rabosai, you have to say that Sumchos holds like the Rabbanan, the Amri, called Davar Shumishum Shavos Gazru Alav Bein Hashmashas. So what you have to say over here is that Halacha Lamaisa, the issue that comes up in this particular situation is that Sumchos holds like the Rabbanan, namely, that anything that is Asr Midrabanan is going to be Asr Bein Hashmashas as well. And Rabosai, Midrabanan, one is not allowed to separate out Trumas and Maisrus on Shabbos. Why not, Rabosai? Because the act of separating out Trumas and Maisrus on Shabbos is like a Makkeh Bepatish. Right? It's like delivering a final hammer blow. It's like rectifying an object. So therefore he can't do it. Therefore Rabosai Sumchos will say that Halacha L'maisa, you're really stuck in this case. Look at Rashi. Gazra Allah ben Hashmashas. Kishe Shabbos Atzma Vagbas Truma Shavosu V'Cheva Demei Karlo Tikno Ubayis Leimar Ibai. Supposed to let this outside. So therefore, according to Sumchas, here's the problem: we're not going to let the Yisrael go ahead and use Truma for his Eruv. Why not? Why can't you just go ahead, annul the Truma designation, go ahead and what? Go ahead and now it becomes Tevel. Even though it's Tevel, just separate out Truma again. To which Simchos will say, I hold like the Rabbanon who hold that anything that is Asr Mid Rabbanon is already Asr Bein Hashmashos. So therefore I will say, because of that, already Bein Hashmashos, which is when, technically speaking, the Eruv takes place, you could not rectify that Eruv to make it edible in any way, and therefore, according to Simchos, it's going to be totally ineffective. Fine, so we'll say, so this is the position of Sumchos. So remember again, Sumchos has no problem letting a Nazir go ahead and make an Eruv with wine. Why? Because you can always have your Neder Nazirus annulled and the wine becomes prohibited. Even though technically speaking there is a way to go ahead and annul a Truma designation, it doesn't help you because the Maisa becomes Tevel and there's an inability to go ahead and separate out Truma in a constructive way from that produce. Kiman azla hadisnan, yesh amra kolafi mashu adam, malakum mincha, so we'll say there are certain shiurim which are subjective shiurim. Subjective shiurim, for example, malakum mincha, the kmitza, the 3 fingerfuls of flour that the Kohen takes by the carbon mincha, that's obviously going to be dependent on the size of the Kohen's fingers. Melochaf naf kitores, the handful of incense that the Kohen takes on Yom Kippur, that's going to be dependent on the size of the hand of the Kohen. Vashos melogma Yom Kippurim, both on Yom Kippur you're chayiv if you drink a cheekful. Obviously a cheekful is a subjective shear. Ubemazon shtei seudos la'eruv. And when it comes to eruv, the amount of food necessary for 2 meals is also a subjective shear. Keman, Abose, whose opinion does this reflect? Rabbi Zera kisumchasi, da amar mai dechazi le ba'inan. Abose, this apparently is the position of Sumchos, because Sumchos says halacha lamaisa, mazon shtei seudos is based on what you need. So it's going to be a subjective shear. Leima pliged Rabbi Shimon Elazar. So we'll say, does he argue Rabbi Shimon Elazar? This Sanya, Rabbi Shimon Elazar, Omer ma'arvin l'chol l'zaki kitei mizono, ula avasan besuda beinan ishal kol adam. So we'll say, but yet we see Rabbi Shimon Elazar says that halacha l'maisa, while it is true that for a zakin or a chola we measure shtei seudos based on what they eat, but if a person is a gluttonous individual, we go ahead and we say that the amount he needs for an eruv is like a normal person's 2 meals. To which the Gemara says, no. Tirgama chola b'zakin, avara avasan Batla daito eitzel kol adam. Halacha lemaisa, we'll say by a gluttonous person. So again, he's an outlier. Because he's an outlier, as we've seen already in the last 2 days, batla daito eitzel kol adam. So we'll say, so fundamental machlokes, sumchos, and the Rabbanan ultimately again in the Mishnah regarding halacha lemaisa, the use of prohibited items for an Eruv. Sumcha says a Nazir could use wine because a Nazir could always have the Neder Nazirus annulled, but can't use Truma. Again, the Rabbanan are okay with you using either of these items. Why? Because again, the Rabbanan l'shitasam hold the Eruv need not be consumable by the person who made the Eruv, it just needs to be consumable by someone. But let's do one more piece. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Huda, Beis HaPras, or the Kohen Beis HaPras. We'll say now this is talking about the placement of the Eruv. You can go ahead and place the Eruv for a Kohen in a Beis HaPras. We'll remember again, the Beis HaPras, actually we'll say we'll stop over here. We'll pick up Emir Hashem with this case, a Kohen Beis HaPras, Emir Hashem tomorrow. Shayach HaBosai.